Sign the deed, Antonella, or Dom will drag you off this porch by your hair. Eleanor sneered, tapping her silver-tipped cane against the weathered floorboards. My father bled for this Montana soil. You're stealing it, Antonella screamed, struggling against the heavy grip of Dom Bichel. The deputy laughed, twisting her arm harder. The bank owns you, Eleanor whispered, holding out the pen. Before the ink could touch the paper, a thunderous voice echoed from the tree line. Step away from her. The lady's debts are paid in full. The late August sun beat down mercilessly on the Bitterroot Valley, baking the Montana soil until it cracked like old porcelain. At the edge of the sprawling Tropea ranch, the wind carried the scent of dry pine and impending ruin. Antonella Tropea stood on the wraparound porch of her family's homestead, her dark, sweat-dampened hair plastered to her forehead. Her hands, calloused from years of mending fences and breaking wild Appaloosas, were clenched into white-knuckled fists. Before her stood Eleanor Barr, a woman whose heart was as cold as the polished silver handle of the cane she leaned upon, dressed in immaculate, dark maroon silk that seemed entirely out of place in the dusty frontier. Eleanor represented the Helena National Bank. More accurately, she represented the insatiable greed of the East, creeping westward to devour the vulnerable. Flanking Eleanor was Dom Bichel, the corrupt local deputy whose badge was merely a license for brutality. This is a tragedy, my dear. Truly it is, Eleanor purred, her voice dripping with venomous sympathy. But your late father's debts are unignorable. The bank requires its $2,000, or it requires the deed to this land. You have until sundown. You know I don't have the coin, Eleanor, Antonella said, her voice trembling not from fear, but from a boiling, helpless rage. The winter killed half the herd, and you manipulated the cattle prices in Missoula so I couldn't sell the rest. You engineered this. Dom took a heavy, menacing step forward, his hand resting on the walnut grip of his Colt. 45. Watch your tone, little lady. Miss Barr is just doing lawful business. From the side of the house, Myrte Martinson, Antonella's fiercely loyal Norwegian ranch hand, emerged with a pitchfork clutched in her hands. Her blonde braids swung wildly as she charged. You leave her alone. You vultures, Myrte yelled, her accent thick with fury, but Dom was faster. He backhanded Myrte across the jaw with sickening force. The heavy silver ring on his finger caught her cheek, sending the sturdy woman tumbling into the dust. Myrte, Antonella cried, lunging forward, but Dom caught her by the arm, twisting it violently behind her back. The pain was sharp and blinding. Sign the deed, Antonella, or Dom will drag you off this porch by your hair. Eleanor sneered, tapping her silver-tipped cane against the weathered floorboards. My father bled for this Montana soil. You're stealing it, Antonella screamed, struggling against the heavy grip of Dom Bichel. The deputy laughed, twisting her arm harder. The bank owns you, Eleanor whispered, holding out the pen. Before the ink could touch the paper, a thunderous voice echoed from the tree line. Step away from her. The lady's debts are paid in full. Every head snapped toward the shadow of the massive ponderosa pines. Stepping into the blinding sunlight was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the granite of the Bitterroot Mountains. He was towering, his broad shoulders draped in a scarred elk-hide coat despite the heat. A wide-brimmed Stetson shadowed his eyes, and resting easily in his massive hands was a lever-action Winchester 1886. This was Mariusz Litwa. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a mountain lion, his boots kicking up no dust as he closed the distance to the porch. Dom immediately released Antonella and drew his Colt, his bravado returning. Hold it right there, mountain trash. This is official bank business. Mariusz didn't even look at Dom. He kept his piercing, ice-blue eyes fixed entirely on Eleanor. He reached into the deep pocket of his coat and pulled out two heavy, oilskin leather pouches. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed them onto the porch at Eleanor's pristine leather boots. The pouches hit the floorboards with a dense, metallic thud that made the timbers groan. $2,000 in unminted Klondike gold, Mariusz said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Antonella's chest. Weighed, assayed, and certified in Denver. The Tropea debt is settled. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound on the Tropea ranch was the dry rustle of cottonwood leaves scraping together in the hot afternoon breeze. Antonella's heart hammered against her ribs, her arms still throbbing with a dull ache from Dom's vicious grip. She stared at the two oilskin pouches lying on the worn porch boards, then lifted her gaze to the towering stranger. He stood as immovable as an old-growth pine, his presence commanding an absolute, suffocating authority that made the suffocating August heat seem trivial. Eleanor stared at the oilskin bags, as if they were venomous diamondback rattlesnakes coiled to strike. Her perfectly composed features twitched, the carefully curated mask of polite superiority, refined in the high society parlors of Helena, began to slip, revealing the raw, ugly, and desperate greed pulsating beneath. "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded. Her voice, previously a smooth, patronizing purr, was now shrill and edged with panic. "You have no legal standing here. This is a private foreclosure between the Helena National Bank and Miss Tropia. You cannot simply interrupt a legal seizure." Mariusz finally turned his ice-blue gaze to Dom. The deputy still had his gun drawn, but the barrel had begun to tremble. A bead of sweat traced a path through the dust on Dom's temple. The sheer physical presence of the mountain man was overwhelming. Mariusz radiated a quiet, absolute capacity for violence, the kind of lethal stillness that predators exhibited right before a kill. It made the corrupt deputy's blood run cold. "Put the iron away, boy, before I make you eat it," Mariusz said softly. It wasn't a shout. It barely carried over the wind. He didn't raise his Winchester or even tense his shoulders. He merely shifted his stance by a fraction of an inch, locking his eyes onto Dom's. The threat was so profound, so terrifyingly certain, that Dom swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet. Slowly, reluctantly, he holstered the Colt, taking a cautious, cowardly step backward. Satisfied, Mariusz turned his attention back to Eleanor. "My name is Mariusz Litwa, and as of this morning, registered by telegram with the territorial judge in Missoula, I am a silent partner in the Tropia ranch, which gives me every right to pay her debts. Open the bags, Miss Barr. Count your 30 pieces of silver." Antonella rubbed her bruised arm, her mouth slightly parted in absolute shock. She had never seen this rugged, scarred man before in her life. Yet he had just materialized from the wilderness to drop a king's ransom at her feet. She looked over at Mirt, who was picking herself up from the dirt, a bloody hand pressed to her bruised cheek, her blue eyes wide with equal bewilderment. Eleanor's upper lip curled into a sneer. She gestured to her hired muscle with her cane. "Check it, Dom." Probably filled with river rocks and fool's gold. Dom knelt reluctantly, his hands shaking slightly as he untied the thick leather drawstrings. As the heavy oilskin fell open, the harsh Montana sun caught the contents. A collective gasp seemed to get sucked from the air. Heavy, raw gold nuggets, some the size of walnuts, glimmering with a deep, buttery, hypnotic yellow light spilled onto the wood. Wrapped tightly around the gold were official, wax-sealed assay office papers from Colorado, verifying the exact weight, carat, and unblemished purity of the whole. It's real, Miss Barr," Dom stammered, his eyes going wide and hungry with avarice. His fingers hovered over the gleaming pile, tempted to touch it. "It's more than 2,000. Looks closer to 3. Eleanor's face contorted in a flush of mottled, unadulterated fury. Her master plan, so meticulously crafted and ruthlessly executed over 2 years to drive Antonella into absolute ruin, was disintegrating before her eyes. "This changes nothing," she spat, her voice trembling with rage, though her eyes were helplessly locked on the gold. "The deadline is sundown. The bank operates on standardized territorial scrip. I could refuse this as improper currency and take the deed anyway. It's legal tender under the Mining Act in the territory of Montana, and you damn well know it," Mariusz countered. He stepped up onto the porch. The thick floorboards groaned loudly under his immense weight. He towered over the banker, casting a long, dark, suffocating shadow over her pristine silk dress. "Take the 2,000. The rest is a penalty for the bruise on that woman's face," he nodded toward Mirt, "and for laying your filthy hands on Antonella. Take it, write the receipt, and get off this land. Now." Eleanor snatched the assay papers from Dom's hand, her breathing ragged. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that she was utterly outmatched. Without the backing of her 6 hired guns who were currently drinking away their advance pay in a Missoula saloon, she had no power here. "Write the receipt, Dom," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Trembling, Dom pulled a leather-bound ledger and a fountain pen from his saddlebag. He hastily scrawled a receipt of payment in full, his handwriting jerky, before stamping it with the bank's official wax seal. Mariusz took the paper from his shaking hand, inspected the wet ink carefully, and handed it to Antonella. "This isn't over, Tropia," Eleanor snarled, turning to walk toward her polished buggy, her cane stabbing the dirt. "You can't pay for protection forever. You just made an enemy of the most powerful syndicate in the state. We will crush you." "And you," Mariusz called after her, his voice carrying like a rifle shot across the open valley, "just made an enemy of me. I wouldn't test that if I were you." As Eleanor and Dom's buggy disappeared down the trail in a cloud of furious, churning dust, Antonella looked at the life-saving receipt in her hand. She then looked up at the giant of a man who had just pulled her from the edge of the abyss. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of the emotion. "Who are you?" Inside the cool, shadowed interior of the ranch house, the air felt worlds away from the blistering heat and violence of the porch. The rich, dark aroma of Arbuckle's coffee filled the kitchen, mingling with the faint, comforting scent of dried lavender that Antonella's mother used to hang from the rafters. Myrta sat heavily at the worn oak table, holding a cold tin cup to her rapidly swelling cheek, while Antonella poured 3 mugs of the steaming liquid from a cast-iron pot. Mariusz had to duck his broad shoulders considerably to enter the kitchen, his massive frame making the familiar, homey room feel suddenly very small. He took off his Stetson, revealing thick, dark hair heavily streaked with premature silver. The harsh light of the outdoors had hidden the deep lines etched around his eyes that held the quiet, profound sorrow of 100 harsh winters. Antonella set a mug in front of him. Her hands were still shaking slightly, the adrenaline beginning to crash and leave her feeling hollowed out. $2,000, Mr. Litwa, she said, pulling a chair out across from him. "A man doesn't drop a lifetime of gold on a stranger's porch without a profound reason. I need to know why you did this." Mariusz wrapped his large, heavily scarred hands around the delicate tin mug. He seemed to draw comfort from the heat radiating into his knuckles. "We aren't strangers, Miss Tropea." "Not really. Did your father ever tell you about the winter of '79? Up near the Lolo Pass?" Antonella frowned, her brow furrowing as she searched her memory. "My father, Giuseppe, he was a trapper long before he bought this land and settled down. He spoke of a terrible blizzard that year. He called it the White Devil. Said the snow was 10 feet deep in the valleys and the wind could freeze a man's lungs in his chest." Mariusz nodded slowly, his eyes going distant. He stared into the rising steam of the coffee, seeing ghosts dancing in the vapor. "I was a younger man then, stubborn, arrogant. I stayed in the high country too long, thinking I could outrun the frost and bag a few more pelts. The blizzard caught me in a narrow ravine just below the tree line. My horse broke its leg in a hidden crevasse, and my provisions froze solid within hours. I lay in that snowbank for 2 days, buried under a drift, just waiting to die. The cold had already taken the feeling from my limbs, and it was starting to take my mind. I was hallucinating, seeing my dead mother walking through the pines." He paused, taking a slow sip of the scalding coffee, before looking directly into Antonella's eyes. "Then, I heard the crunch of snowshoes. Your father found me. He didn't know me from any other fool who challenged the mountains. I was a Polish immigrant with nothing to my name but a ruined rifle, half dead and delirious. But Giuseppe didn't hesitate. He strapped me to his own sled and dragged me for 3 agonizing days through the worst storm of the decade. I remember waking up in fragments, seeing his back bowed against the wind, pulling my dead weight through waist-deep powder. He lost 2 toes to frostbite on that trek, purely to save a stranger." Antonella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. A vivid memory hit her father's distinct, heavy limp, the one he had always cheerfully brushed off as an old, foolish hunting injury from his youth. He had never told her the true price he paid. "When I finally woke up in his trapping cabin, feverish and weak," Mariusz continued, his voice softening to a reverent murmur, "I asked him how I could ever possibly repay him for my life. Giuseppe just smiled, stirred the fire, and said, 'A man's life belongs to the ones he leaves behind. If you ever want to pay me back, look after my blood.' I made him a sacred promise that day." Tears finally breached the dam of Antonella's stoicism, welling in her eyes and tracing clean tracks down her soot and dust-streaked cheeks. Since her father's sudden death from a fever 2 years ago, she had felt utterly, terrifyingly alone in a world seemingly designed to crush her. Every single day had been a brutal fight for survival, a desperate, exhausting struggle against the encroaching greed of the bankers and the unforgiving Montana seasons. To know that her father's profound kindness, echoing from a frozen mountain pass a decade ago, had traversed time and distance to save her now. It broke her completely. She reached across the worn oak table and placed her hand firmly over Marius's. His skin was rough, calloused like tanned leather, but it was incredibly warm and steady. He would be so incredibly proud to know you kept your word. Marius looked down at her hand, resting on his, a profound gentleness softening his hardened, weather-beaten features. I spent the last 7 years in the Klondike, swinging a pickaxe, digging that gold out of the ice and permafrost. When I finally came down and heard Giuseppe had passed, and that the Helena National Bank was moving to seize his legacy, I rode straight down from the Yukon. I didn't stop to sleep. I'm just sorry I was almost too late. You were right on time, Mountain Man. Myrta chimed in from the corner, a grim, admiring smile cracking her bruised face. But that wicked witch, Eleanor, she won't stop at this. She wants this land too badly. It ain't just about the cattle or the timber. I've seen her looking at the northern ridge. Marius's jaw tightened, the tender moment passing as the reality of their situation settled back in. I know, the bank doesn't send their senior director out for a simple, run-of-the-mill foreclosure. There's something buried beneath this soil they want, and they want it cheap. And people like Eleanor Barr, they don't accept defeat. They will come back, and they will come back in the dark. He looked at Antonella, his blue eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising, protective light. But they will have to go through me first. The twist in Eleanor Barr's sinister plot lay hidden beneath the very grass the Tropea cattle grazed upon. It wasn't the surface land she craved. It was what lay 100 feet below. A surveyor, bribed heavily by Eleanor months prior, had discovered a massive, untapped vein of silver ore running directly through the northern ridge of Antonella's property. If Eleanor could seize the deed, she could sell the mineral rights to the Anaconda Mining Company for 50 times what the ranch was worth, cementing her power in Montana's political elite. Humiliated and furious from the afternoon's defeat, Eleanor retreated to her opulent office in Missoula. She poured a glass of expensive bourbon, her hands shaking with rage. Dom Bichel stood nervously by the door, cradling his pride. The legal route is closed, Eleanor hissed, staring at the amber liquid. That mountain savage bought the deed free and clear. If we cannot take the ranch by paper, we will take it by ash. Antonella will sell the land for pennies if she has nothing left to stand on. You want me to burn it? Dom asked, his eyes widening. Arson was a hanging offense in the territory. I want you to burn the barn, poison the main well, and slaughter the prize. Appaloosas, Eleanor commanded coldly. Make her desperate. Take 3 men. Do it tonight. Back at the ranch, the moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of storm clouds. The air was heavy, stifling, and thick with tension. Marius hadn't slept. He sat on the porch in the pitch black, his Winchester resting across his knees, listening to the night. His years in the wild had honed his senses to a razor's edge. Just past midnight, the wind shifted. Marius smelled it before he saw it. The sharp, acrid stench of kerosene. He vaulted over the porch railing, landing silently in the dirt. Antonella, Myrta, get up, he bellowed, his voice shattering the stillness. A moment later, a massive whoosh echoed from the south paddock. Flames erupted into the night sky, devouring the dry timber of the main barn. The panicked screams of the trapped Appaloosa horses pierced the air, a sound that tore at Antonella's heart as she rushed out the front door, still in her nightgown, grabbing a bucket. The horses, she screamed, running toward the inferno. Myrta, the well, wet the house roof. Marius barked. He didn't run for the water. He ran straight for the fire, his eyes scanning the darkness around the flames. He knew arsonists liked to watch their work. Through the roaring heat, Marius spotted 3 shadows slipping away toward the tree line. Dom Bichel and 2 hired thugs. Marius threw his coat aside and sprinted into the burning barn. The heat was blistering, singing his hair and eyelashes. Beams were groaning, raining sparks down on the terrified horses. With sheer brute strength, Marius kicked the heavy stall doors off their iron hinges, slapping the horses' rumps to send them bolting out into the safety of the open pasture. As the last horse cleared the doors, the roof began to collapse. Marius dove out into the dirt just as the structure caved in on itself in a shower of sparks and roaring fire. Antonella was there, falling to her knees beside him, her face smeared with soot. You saved them, she sobbed, clutching his arm. Mariusz, you saved them. Mariusz rose to his feet, his eyes locked on the tree line. The gentle savior was gone. The hardened survivor of the mountains had taken his place. Stay with Myrte. Keep the fire from spreading to the house. Where are you going? She asked, terrified by the cold, lethal calm in his voice. To collect a debt, Mariusz growled, racking the lever of his Winchester. He stalked into the darkness, moving with terrifying speed. He caught the slowest of the thugs a quarter-mile away, dragging him out of the brush by his collar. A brief, brutal interrogation under the barrel of the 1886 revealed everything. The silver vein, Eleanor's master plan, and Dom's involvement. The Vipers had struck, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the apex predator they had awakened. Hard karma rarely arrives gently. For Eleanor Barr, it arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of absolute, unmitigated ruin. Mariusz didn't just ride into Missoula with his guns blazing. He was a man of the mountains, which meant he knew how to lay a trap. He used the remaining gold from his Klondike stash, alongside the bruised, terrified confession of the hired thug, to bypass the local corrupt lawmen entirely. He rode through the night to the territorial capital and woke the federal marshal, a man known for his ironclad incorruptibility. By mid-morning, Eleanor was sitting at her mahogany desk at the Helena National Bank branch in Missoula, sipping tea and waiting for the telegram confirming the destruction of the Tropea ranch. Instead, the heavy oak doors of the bank burst open. Mariusz Litwa strode in, looking like a storm cloud made flesh. The soot from the fire still stained his clothes, and his eyes were chips of blue ice. Behind him walked Federal Marshal Thomas Vance, flanked by 4 armed deputies. Eleanor stood up, her teacup rattling against the saucer. "What is the meaning of this? Marshal, remove this vagrant from my bank." Dom Bichel, who had been lounging by the teller cages, immediately reached for his Colt. He never even touched the grip. In a blur of motion too fast for a man his size, Mariusz drew a heavy Walker Colt from his hip. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed marble room. The bullet shattered the heavy oak paneling just a millimeter from Dom's hand, sending splinters tearing into the deputy's wrist. Dom screamed, dropping to his knees, clutching his bleeding arm. "Move again, and the next one goes through your teeth," Mariusz stated, his voice dangerously low. Marshal Vance stepped forward, slapping a thick stack of papers onto Eleanor's desk. "Eleanor Barr, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, attempted murder, and federal bank fraud. We have the confession of your hired man, and the territorial assayer has confirmed you suppressed the geological reports of the Bitterroot silver vein to illegally seize the Tropea property." Eleanor's face drained of all color. "This is absurd. I am a senior director of this bank. You cannot touch me on the word of a mountain savage and a common criminal." "We can," Vance said grimly, "because Mr. Litwa here just purchased the entire debt portfolio of this branch. Your superiors in Helena threw you to the wolves the moment we presented the evidence. Your assets are frozen. You have nothing." The utter shock of it hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The arrogant, untouchable queen of Missoula's financial elite had been utterly dismantled in a matter of hours. Dom, writhing on the floor, looked up and pointed his bloody hand at Eleanor. "She made me do it. She paid me to burn the barn." "I'll testify, Marshal. I'll tell you everything." Eleanor looked at her sniveling accomplice with absolute disgust, then looked up at Mariusz. The mountain man simply holstered his weapon, his expression devoid of sympathy. "You thought power was paper and silver," Mariusz said, leaning over her desk. "Power is the earth you stand on, and the people who stand with you. You have neither." As the deputies hauled a kicking, screaming Eleanor out of the bank, parading her humiliated in front of the townspeople she had ruthlessly exploited for years, Mariusz turned his back on her. He had a ranch to rebuild. September brought a cool, crisp breeze to the Bitterroot Valley, turning the cottonwood leaves to brilliant shades of gold and amber. The scent of smoke was gone, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of freshly cut pine. At the Tropea Ranch, the frame of a new, larger barn was already rising against the sky. Myrta, her bruise faded to a pale yellow, was hammering nails with rhythmic, joyful strikes, singing a lively Norwegian folk song that echoed across the pasture. Antonella stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked out over the land, her land, the silver vein deep below the ridge, had been officially leased to an independent mining firm under her strict conditions, ensuring the ranch would never face financial ruin again, nor would the land be destroyed by strip mining. She watched Mariusz walking up from the creek. He carried a massive log over one shoulder as if it weighed nothing, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. When he reached the porch, he dropped the timber with a heavy thud, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Antonella handed him a cool glass of lemonade. "You're working yourself to the bone, Mariusz. You paid my debt, you saved my life, and you ruined my enemies. Your promise to my father is more than fulfilled. You're free to go back to the mountains." Mariusz took the glass, his fingers brushing against hers. He didn't look at the mountains in the distance. He looked right at her. The sorrow that had clouded his eyes for years was gone, replaced by something warm and profoundly grounded. "I've spent my whole life walking, Antonella," he said softly, his deep voice carrying a tender vulnerability, "looking for the next ridge, the next strike, the next winter. But a man can only wander for so long before his soul starts to freeze." He set the glass down and reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of heavy parchment. He handed it to her. Antonella opened it. It was the deed to the ranch, but her name was not the only one on it. He had legally transferred half the ownership to her, securing her future entirely, while maintaining his silent partnership. "I don't want the deed," Antonella whispered, tears pricking her eyes as she looked up at him. "I want the man." Mariusz's rugged face broke into a rare, beautiful smile. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his calloused hands. "The mountains are cold," he murmured, leaning his forehead against hers. "I think it's time I set down some roots in the rock." As he pulled her into a deep, long-awaited embrace, the afternoon sun washed over the porch. The ghosts of the past were finally laid to rest, honored and released. From the ashes of greed and fire, a new legacy had been forged in the Bitterroot Valley, one built not on stolen silver, but on the unbreakable bonds of hard karma, loyalty, and a love deeper than the Montana soil. Sometimes in life, our darkest moments are simply the prelude to our greatest rescue. Antonella's story reminds us that hard karma always finds those who exploit the vulnerable, and that true wealth lies not in silver or land, but in loyalty, honor, and love. Just like Mariusz stepping out of the timber, help often arrives when we least expect it. In our own lives, let us strive to be the mountain man for others, offering a hand when the chips are down, standing firm against arrogance, and protecting what truly matters. If this story of rugged justice, deep emotion, and fierce resilience moved your heart, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful, soulful tales to life. Keep riding tall, and we'll see you in the next story.